want to share with you 10 mistakes I made the first time I applied to medical school, where I applied with a 3.1 GPA, 509 MCAT, got one interview at Case Western, got waitlisted, never pulled off. So then I'll share what I did to fix those mistakes the second time I applied, where I was able to earn 10 acceptances with a 3.3 GPA, 516 MCAT, and now I'm a second-year medical student. So let's get started. First, be sure to know that I have a free pre-med workshop, so if you're applying to medical school this cycle, next cycle, whenever, sometime in the near future, this workshop is for you. It has a lot more specifics where you can actually see the essays from my application when I first applied versus the second time I applied, and a lot of good examples and steps you can take to make your application be similar as far as having really good essays and making a good school list. And it's jam-packed with information. It's an hour long and you will not regret going. It's free. So go to the link below, make sure you register for that. And there's even a cute little workbook that comes with it. So yeah, you don't want to miss out on that. Now let's get started on the 10 mistakes. Mistake number 1 is that I only applied to 4 schools. So you're kind of supposed to cast a wide net when you apply to medical school, but I was pretty lost, very clueless when I first applied. And it was overwhelming enough to apply to those 4 schools. I actually submitted 6 primaries, but I didn't really know that secondaries existed. So I was only able to manage submitting 4 of those, like way past the 2-week turnaround time frame. It was a mess. So obviously, like, numbers were not in my favor. Like, I had a low GPA, like that's a separate thing, but like numbers just as far as like how many schools got my applications definitely did not make that in my favor. The second time I applied to 28 schools, 24 MD and 4 DO. So first time I applied, did not apply to DO just because probably didn't even know that DO schools existed, to be honest. But the second time I definitely knew they existed and I wanted to cast a wide, broad net. So one, I did so much more research. Like the first time I applied, one of those 4 schools was a public school in Alabama where I didn't even know that I didn't make the GPA cutoff for out-of-state students. Didn't know that residency bias was a thing. So not only did I apply to way more schools, I also researched to make sure I wasn't applying to schools I literally had no chance at because I didn't meet like the out-of-state cutoffs or like things like that. So big improvement for that one. That goes into number 2, is just not knowing about residency bias. So if you didn't know, like if you're a resident of any other state but Mississippi and you didn't know that you have 0 chance of getting in at University of Mississippi, called UMMC, whatever that stands for, the school in Mississippi, the MD school, then maybe you don't know about residency bias either, which is fine. Now you do. And what you use to look for that is the MSAR. And this applies more for MD schools. I found it was much less of a thing for DO schools. I think their funding is different to where it's not quite the same. So that's another thing I go into specifics about in my free pre-med workshop, so I won't go too much into it here. But not knowing about residency bias was definitely a mistake. We already talked about the Alabama school fiasco. So the second time I applied, I did know and was able to not waste my money. Number 3 is I didn't know how to answer why medicine for interviews. Guys, I wish that they had a recording of my interview at Case Western, the one that I did get, when she asked me, like, why do you want to be a doctor? Like, you should know, like, you should really have a planned out answer. Obviously, you don't want to sound like a robot, but you shouldn't get tripped up when you get asked that, because you will get asked that. So make sure that's one of the ones like you are like ready to just nail down that answer. Don't sound like you're reading from your script, but you need to know how you're going to answer that. So the first time I applied, I have no idea what I said. I said something about like connecting the dots between like science and like something. I don't know. I just remember something about connecting the dots, like making some like analogy or something. The second time I applied, I really knew that this was super important. I knew I was going to get asked it. And I had 15 interview invites, 13 of which I went to. So the second time, what I did was basically retell my personal statement. Like, that's totally fine. Some interviewers don't even have access to your personal statement, but I just reiterated like my story. Like, I was undecided in medical school, but I knew math or science, and then I picked my major, and then I shadowed, and that was like what got me hooked. Then I worked as an EMT, and I was like handing off these critical patients, and I wanted more. I wanted to be the one that was able to treat and diagnose, blah blah. So like, this was like what, 2+ years ago that I was doing these interviews, and I could still like give you the spiel of how I answered that. interview question versus the first time I was just like, oh, like I clearly had not practiced, didn't know, nothing. It was bad. Number 4 is that I applied late in the cycle. So let me tell you a little bit about like my spiel for this one. Applying the very last day that the cycle is open does not mean you have 0 chance of getting in. I already had a well below average GPA for like medical students. So I did not care if something is going to give me a 0.5% increased chance of getting in. I will do that thing like it's giving me like triple the chance of getting in. Like no matter how small the factor, my mentality was like I will maximize it. So would it have been possible to get in and have success by applying the last day of the cycle? Maybe. But statistically, with rolling admissions, like the later in the cycle, the more seats that are already filled up, I was going to use every little thing to my advantage. So I already had other factors going against me the first time I applied, obviously, but applying, like submitting my primary app in mid-July was something else that just like was not working in my favor. So clearly the thing to improve the second time I applied, I submitted my primary app on June 3rd. And 3 weeks later, it was verified. I was in the very first round of those applications, like getting secondaries. And then obviously I did my secondaries really, really quickly, like even before the 2-week time frame. So I was in that like very first round of being considered for interviews versus like who knows how many rounds down that first time that I applied. Number 5 is that I didn't know what secondaries were. So we touched on this a little bit, but what I didn't share was what I did the second time. So obviously these caught me by surprise big time. I basically thought once you submitted your primary application, you were done writing essays. And that's not the case. So secondary apps, if you don't already know, like the gist is just that your primary app is this one app that gets sent to multiple schools. Then the secondary apps are each school sending you their school-specific applications with more essays. It could be anywhere from 1 to 6. Like, so let's say average of 3. If you apply to 20 schools, 3 times 20 is 60. So that's 60 more essays to be written. I was just freaking clueless and just like, I don't know why it was so hard for me to write like, what, 6 schools, like maybe 18 essays? I guess, yeah. Anyway, but the second time I applied, obviously I applied to way more schools, but I was able to handle it so much better. With like, one, I did not pre-write my secondaries, which you can do. That's a great tactic. I personally didn't have the motivation to do that because when I submitted my primary, I had also just finished MCAT studying, and I was not about to spend that 4 weeks writing more essays before the applications even rolled in. Like, I just don't have that motivation. So when they did start writing in though, it became basically, I went from full-time job was MCAT studying outside of my other job as an EMT. And once secondary started rolling in, I was like, all right, now I had a little bit of a break. Now my full-time job is doing essays. Like, so I spent hours upon hours a day. Like, so there's obviously pros and cons, right? Like, if you don't have the motivation like me, what's the point in starting early? If you do have the motivation, you know, you won't have to spend 10 hours one day just like writing essays. But in addition to just like having the mentality that writing essays was my new full-time job after the MCAT, I also had a very solid system for how I answered the secondary essays. And then like, if there was another similar one, I was able to do it super, super quick because a lot of the prompts are, one, they could be very, very much the same or different, but very similar. So you might just need to do tweaks and stuff. And so obviously with my secondary essays or the prompts, I was answering the question and then supporting it with a story. So I basically just had a bank of a bunch of stories that would fit different things. For example, so if there is something like, what is something that was, or how do you show adversity? Or like, let's do, what's your strongest quality? So, or what's your biggest strength? And then like, tell us about a time that you showed you were adaptable. So those are 2 different prompts. It could be from 2 different schools, but I can use the exact same story to explain my answer. What's my greatest strength? Adaptability. Story? Well, when I was an EMT during COVID, my partner, Lacey, was out for 5 weeks. And so every single shift I had a different partner and I had to learn to work with them and blah, blah, blah. So that was my story for that answer. Tell us about a time when you were adaptable. All right, well, that's a different prompt, but again, I can definitely use that story. So, well, this one time I was adaptable was during blah, blah, blah. My Lacey was out for 5 weeks, and then continue the story. So answering the prompt, then backing it up with a story to like, be like, yeah, I'm not just saying I have this quality, like I'm actually showing you a real life example. Eventually you have enough stories to where like later down the line, you're like, oh, I can use this story, tweak this, this, and this, and bam. So I was like very, like I had a system and I was able to get those things done. Like sometimes, let's say 5 rolled in one day and I had already like done 10. I could look at those, pick out 2 of the 5 that had essays where I was like, oh yeah, I can use this story, and that story to answer those 3 essays. So I'll do this one today. And in 2 hours, I had submitted that secondary app that I had just gotten earlier that day. And then so the other 3, I'm like, oh, these 2 I can reuse, but this one's a new prompt that I don't like have anything in my bank. So I'm gonna take like 2 days, and it would be like a couple days later when I would actually submit that one, just because I had to write a fresh essay. So that was kind of a longer explanation, but that's how I improved getting my secondaries in faster the second time. Number 6 is that I took my MCAT late in the cycle, so there wasn't a lot I could do better the second time I applied because I was applying during COVID. First time I applied, I took it July 22nd. That's less than ideal. Again, I already touched on the fact that I have other weaknesses in my application, so stacking on more weaknesses wasn't helpful for me. Like some of my RTA students, like all the other factors of their application is great. They have above a 3.7 GPA, they have clinical experience, they have leadership, volunteering, like they have all this stuff. So when they're asking me when's like late, I'm like, well, you know, it's not ideal to take it like late June, but if that's your one weakness, it's not the end of the world. Like consider applying next cycle. If you really don't want to, like the rest of your factors are really good, so I wouldn't worry about it as much. For me, I have plenty of weaknesses. So the second time I applied, I made sure that my MCAT score was back before schools were getting those verified primary applications. And I was able to do that even though the second time I took it, it was like mid-June, but because it was due to COVID and tests were getting canceled, I got my score back in 2 weeks instead of 4 weeks. So it still worked out that way. And if it hadn't, it was out of my control because COVID, like literally the test date I wanted in May got canceled. So that's how I proved that one. Number 7, this is a little cheesy. And these are in like the most random order is what I'm realizing, but I'm not going to go back and redo this at this point. So number 7 is that I didn't believe it in myself. Like sounds cheesy, but truly the amount of doubt that I had the first time I applied to medical school, when I didn't get any other interviews but that one and I didn't get pulled off the wait list, I was like, well, like, of course I didn't. Like, people like me don't go to medical school. Like, who am I to think that I could go to medical school? I was embarrassed. I was ashamed that I even told people that I was trying to go to medical school. And unlike now where on Instagram, I could probably find a bunch of people that are sharing their stories that have low GPAs and like, you know, didn't know they wanted to be a doctor till like junior year of college, or like got a 2.7 and then like did post back and got into medical school. I had 0 of those stories when I was applying to medical school. I truly did not think you could be a doctor or could get into medical school unless you were perfect. Like you had to have straight A's, you had to know you were going to be a doctor since 5. Like I just had the mentality, which I guess partially that's, you know, representation is important, you know, like if I didn't see it in real life, like how would I have known? Like no wonder I was embarrassed and didn't think I could do it. But basically what was different the second time that I applied, I still didn't have many examples, but I had found Dr. Gray and he had some YouTube videos and podcasts where people did get in with lower GPAs. So that's when I started to think like, wait, there are actually people getting into medical school with like not perfect grades. And then I had more of a mentality, well, I still have plenty of doubts because at the end of the day, there's tens of thousands of people applying to each school. Like literally Colorado, the school I go to, had over 10,000 applicants. So you're gonna have doubts, but I wasn't like embarrassed or like ashamed or think that like, oh, well, duh, I'm not gonna get into medical school. So there were doubts, but there were less like, I don't know. That one's like hard to like really improve on, but I definitely did have a different mentality of like, no, I can do this. Like, let me make a list of weaknesses, fix those weaknesses, and then give it my best shot. Versus the first time I was like, people like me don't go to medical school. Like, I'm a terrible student. Like, who am I thinking? Who do I think I am? Number 8 is that I wrote generic and oh so cringy essays the first time that I applied. And I kind of mentioned Dr. Gray. He had a lot of good examples of like what an essay should look like, and that's how I learned like how to write stories. and how I realized that my essays when I first applied were terrible. And like literally he would like say like, oh my gosh, don't do this, this is so bad. And I'd be like, oh my gosh, he's calling me out. Like, okay, I won't do that. So the second time I used stories. I wasn't trying to like Google, okay, what are the qualities of doctor? Works well under pressure, and is collaborative and blah, blah, blah. Okay, let me plug in those words to my essays. No, I like wrote stories. I like really, and basically like what it came to, I have more specific examples in my workshop, so I won't do a lot of examples here, but really what changed the second time after doing those stories is I felt like people reading like from a piece of paper could literally like get to know so much about me. Like I was really proud at like the accumulation of all the essays I wrote for primary, so personal statement, extracurricular essays, then all my essays for secondaries. I was like, wow, like I'm so proud of like the essays that I shared and like how they'll get to know me through these stories that I shared to back up my answers. I just felt really proud. And then you get to interviews and like you are like continuing to just like answer the question and then be like, yeah, and here's an example of how I did that and tell a story, and you have so much fun. I was like nerding. I had the best time at interviews because I had like learned just to share stories and like be who you are, and in like a formal way, obviously. It was so much fun. So when you're trying to like impress them and plug in this and this word and be like, yeah, I have that and that, like it's like, ugh. Like versus you're using stories and you're sharing about your life and like why things are important to you, why you want to be blah blah blah, and you're like, wow, yeah, this is me. Like I don't know, you know, once you apply you'll understand what I mean. Number 9, on the topic of essays, my personal statement definitely did not answer why medicine. Again, well, you can see exactly in the workshop, but I spent over half of the essay the first time I applied telling a story about being a server. I spent over 2/3 of the essay just explaining that because I was a server and I worked so much, that's why my grades were bad. That's not the purpose of the personal statement. Oh my gosh, no. So the second time I applied, I actually like did where I did like my spark, like the very first little inkling and like thing that put me on this pre-med path. And then the rest of the stories were the things I did to explore that interest and what like really like solidified it for me, which obviously I talked about being an EMT. So all the paragraphs in there were geared towards like, hey, here's where it started, where I thought I wanted to work in medicine. Here's the things I did after that to like be like, oh dang, I know I want to be a doctor. And yeah, it was just very, very different things that I did before and after. Lastly, number 10, this is probably the hardest one to like know that I did, because of all those 9 mistakes, and obviously I made plenty more, like more than 10, but of all those like mistakes that I already covered, I somehow still got an interview at an amazing school that I was like absolutely shocked. Of all schools, Case Western was the one that interviewed me with my 3.1 GPA and cringeworthy essays. But I got that opportunity, and then like I did not do enough research before the interview, is my mistake. When she would ask questions like, why do you want to go here? Which again, you're going to be asked, why do you want to be a doctor? Why medicine? And you're going to be asked, why do you want to go to this school? That's another one that's a non-negotiable. You need to have an answer for that. And this one is school specific. So I did not like reach out to students or like go through the website. Like I had a little bit and I mentioned certain things that they had, but it was like, you could tell I was like BSing like what I was saying. Versus the second time I applied, I knew exactly. I like would dig and research about programs they have and like, again, relate it, back it up to why that's important to me. So if it was a program where they could do service learning and you could do like emergency medicine, like EMT volunteering, I'd be like, oh, I want to go here because I know that you guys have, you could be an EMT as a way to get your volunteering hours. And I worked as an EMT. I love the pre-hospital setting. And I just think blah, 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 blah. So like I did my homework and I backed it. Not only, again, like this is obviously a theme that we're probably seeing. Like I always backed up my answers with like, okay, here's my answer, but here's why that's my answer. Like, I want this like curriculum that your school has because it's like, because they have active learning. And like, why do I want active learning? Well, because I know that like when I compare how I learned in college versus when I studied for the MCAT by myself, like blah, blah, blah. Like, so anyway, I did my homework the second time. First time, I would probably sound like a complete idiot when they were like, why do you want to go to this school? And it's like, seriously, as clueless as I was, I got that interview and then I just like, I really should have prepared more for the interview. Like, anyway, Also the second time I invested in mock interview practice. So one, I found a really cheap way in Seattle. Like this person actually helped firefighters get like with their interviews. And so I paid like $25 a month for him to help me. But then after that, I did 3 like with a private company. It was like really expensive and like it's hard to justify paying that much amount for 3 hours and like 3 1-hour mock interviews. But obviously, once I got to that point, I was like, I better not get waitlisted and not pull it off again. Like I will do all it takes for this last leg, unlike last time where like that was a pretty lackluster attempt at like really shining in the interview. So those are my 10 mistakes that I made the first time that I applied to medical school and what I actually did to improve them. So if this video was helpful, you're a pre-med, you're applying to medical school this cycle, next cycle, in the near future, 1, I hope you learned a ton already. 2, be sure to sign up for that pre-med workshop because there's a lot more examples, actionable tips, the workbook, the whole, like, you're gonna feel like you're gonna have a personal statement after reading. Like, I've got a lot of fun activities and examples in there for you to work through. Also, I have a course, Road to Acceptance. We have 7 modules, like more workbooks, more PDFs, more step-by-step guidance of helping you write your essays, learn the application timeline. Like basically all the mistakes that I made the first time I applied, I poured my heart and soul into creating an online course for pre-med students so I could walk you through every little detail that I learned the hard way and create a step-by-step process for you so you don't have to learn the hard way. Also with a Facebook community so you can feel like you're not going through this alone. So I'm in there every day answering questions and meeting all you guys, and yeah, Road to Acceptance is like my pride and joy. So I'll put a link to that below to consider joining us. We'd love to have you in the community. And with that, that's the end of this video. So be sure to like, subscribe, follow along on Instagram, and I'll see you in the next one.